Desperation is a foul-smelling rot that settles in the back of your throat, a thick, metallic tang that tastes like pennies and failure. It was 2:14 a.m., and the silence of my studio apartment was so heavy it felt like it was trying to crush my ribs. My bank account was a hollowed-out husk, $2.14, while my stomach was a knotted void, aching with a hunger that had moved past pain into a dull, vibrating anger. Then, the phone hissed. The notification light pulsed a cold, necrotic blue, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. It was an anonymous text, no sender ID, just a string of digital ghosts. The message was simple, stark, and terrifyingly lucrative. Deliver the box on your porch to Unit 12C, Horizon Arms. $300 cash is waiting in the lobby. Code is 4921. In the rational light of day, I would have seen the trap. I would have recognized the jagged edges of the hook buried deep within the bait. But the blue glow of that screen was a siren song, and greed is a powerful anesthetic for a dying conscience. I opened my front door to find a plain cardboard box sitting on the welcome mat. It was unremarkable, light, and taped shut with surgical precision, as if it contained nothing but stagnant air or a secret that didn't want to be heard. I didn't question it. I didn't shake it to hear the contents rattle. I just gripped the edges until my knuckles turned white and set out toward the Horizon Arms. The building was a skeletal monument to urban decay, a 12-story tomb of concrete and rusted rebar that loomed over the edge of the industrial district like a broken tooth. It had been officially abandoned for a decade, ever since the foundations began to groan and the residents fled from things the city council refused to acknowledge in the public record. As I stood before the main entrance, the only light came from a shivering, low-key glow of my smartphone, painting the world in shades of bruised indigo and icy sapphire. The glass doors were smeared with decades of grime and soot, looking like cataracts over the eyes of a corpse. My fingers trembled as I reached for the keypad, the plastic button sticky with a substance I didn't want to identify. I punched in the code, 4-9-2-1. The mechanism groaned, a rusted, guttural sound that echoed through the empty street like a death rattle, and the lock clicked open with the finality of a guillotine. The lobby smelled of wet limestone, mold, and ancient dust. It was a cathedral of silence, where every breath I took felt like a sacrilege. I stepped inside, the cold air lunging at me, and that's when I saw it. There, sitting atop a marble security desk that was cracked like a dry bone, was a crisp, white envelope. My heart hammered against my teeth, a frantic, rhythmic thudding. I snatched it up, my thumb flicking through the bills. They were real. $300 in cold, hard cash. It was more money than I'd seen in months, and the sight of it sent a jolt of toxic adrenaline through my veins. The cash felt oily against my skin, a filthy benediction that seemed to validate my desperation. I looked toward the stairwell, the elevator having long ago surrendered to the dark and the damp. 12 floors. 12 flights of stairs into the black, festering gullet of the Horizon Arms. The initial spark of curiosity was gone, replaced by a cold, transactional resolve. The money was already in my pocket, warming my thigh with its false promise of security. I had the payment. Now, I just had to pay the price. I turned toward the door to the stairs, my boots crunching on shattered glass that sounded like teeth breaking in the dark. The box felt heavier now, as if the darkness of the lobby was beginning to seep through the cardboard, weighing me down as I prepared to climb into the void. I adjusted my grip, the cold blue light of my phone illuminating the first few steps of a journey I would soon learn I should never have started. 1 step. 2. The lobby faded behind me, swallowed by a silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I adjusted my grip, the cold blue light of my phone illuminating the first few steps of a journey I would soon learn I should never have started. 1 step. 2. The lobby faded behind me, swallowed by a silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive. The Horizon Arms did not just feel abandoned, it felt hollowed out, as if the very soul of the building had been extracted, leaving only a concrete shell that groaned under the weight of its own decay. Every floor was a replica of the last, long, lightless corridors with doors that sat slightly ajar like slack-jawed mouths. I kept my eyes fixed on the numbers painted in flaking lead paint on the stairwell walls. Floor 4. Floor 5. My breathing began to hitch, a ragged, wet sound in the stillness. I tried to focus on the $300 heavy in my pocket. It was a talisman against the dark, a tangible proof that this was just a job, a simple transaction. But as I passed the 8th floor, the air changed. It became thick with the scent of wet drywall and a cloying, metallic sweetness that made the back of my throat itch. By the 10th floor, the flickering yellow light of the lobby was a half-remembered dream. Up here, the darkness was aggressive. My phone's battery was dipping into the red, the screen pulsing a weak, dying glow. I reached the 12th floor and pushed through the heavy fire door. It didn't creak. It moved with a sickening, silent smoothness. The hallway of the 12th floor felt narrower than the others. The ceiling was low, heavy with water-damaged tiles that hung down like rotting tongues. I counted the doors, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 12A, 12B. And then, there it was, 12C. The door was unremarkable, just a slab of scarred wood with a brass plate that had long ago turned black with oxidation. I set the cardboard box down on the threshold. It made a hollow thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I stood there for a second, my hand hovering near the door. The instructions were specific. Knock 3 times. I curled my fist and struck the wood. Knock, knock, knock. The sound hadn't even finished echoing before a noise erupted from behind the door. A sudden, horrific squeal of a panicked pig. It wasn't a recording. It had a wet, physical quality to it, the sound of air being forced through a throat tight with terror. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. I backed away, my heels clicking on the concrete, when a movement to my left caught my eye. A figure stepped out from the darkness of a recessed janitor's closet. He was tall, thin as a rail, and draped in an oversized, greasy raincoat that swept the floor. But it was the face that froze the air in my lungs. He wore a pig mask, but not a cheap plastic one from a party store. This was hyper-realistic, the skin appearing porous and damp, the snout wrinkled as if sniffing the air, and the glass eyes wide and fixed in a permanent, manic stare. The man didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply began to walk toward me with a calm, deliberate pace, humming a soft, upbeat nursery rhyme that sounded obscene in the rotting hallway. Panic, raw and jagged, took hold. I turned and sprinted back the way I came. My vision was a blur of shadows and peeling paint. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about the box. I just needed the exit. I saw the fire door at the end of the hall, the red glow of the emergency sign pulsing like a heartbeat. I put my head down, my legs pumping, driving myself toward the light. I never saw the wire. It was a thin, shimmering line of industrial barbed wire, strung taut across the hallway at mid-thigh height. I hit it at full speed. The barbs didn't just snag my clothes, they bit deep into the meat of my right leg, hooking into the muscle and dragging along the bone as my momentum carried me forward. I was flipped into the air, a strangled cry escaping my throat as I crashed into the dusty floor. The pain was a white-hot explosion that blinded me. I looked down to see my jeans shredded, blood pumping out in dark, rhythmic spurts, soaking into the grime of the horizon arms. I tried to pull away, but the barbs held fast, grinding against my femur. I looked back. The pig-masked man had stopped. He stood 10 feet away, perfectly still, his head tilted to one side. He watched me struggle, watched me bleed, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. He looked like a spectator at a gallery, waiting for the art to finish its performance. Desperation is a powerful anesthetic. I grabbed the wire with my bare hands, the metal slicing into my palms, and I wrenched my leg free with a sickening sound of tearing tissue. I didn't stand. I couldn't. I dragged myself toward the stairwell door, a trail of dark red marking my progress like a morbid map. I reached the handle and yanked. It wouldn't budge. I screamed then, a raw, animal sound, and pulled again. Through the narrow gap in the doorframe, I saw it. A thick wad of filthy, industrial carpet had been jammed into the hinge and the latch, maliciously wedged to keep the door sealed. He had planned the exit as carefully as the trap. I scanned the floor, my fingers brushing against a heavy, rusted pipe that had broken off a radiator. I jammed the end of the pipe into the door crack and leaned back with every ounce of strength left in my fading body. The wood groaned, the carpet compressed, and with a violent crack, the door gave way. I rolled into the stairwell, but before I could pull the door shut, I looked back. The man in the pig mask wasn't moving. He was standing under a flickering light, holding up a large, hand-painted sign. In thick, black letters, it read, "Be M.Y. Valentine." The door clicked shut, plunging me into the relative safety of the stairwell. I slid down the stairs, flight after flight, until the world began to grey out at the edges. The aftermath was a blur of sterile hospital lights and the smell of antiseptic. A detective named Miller sat by my bed the next morning. his face a mask of professional boredom that broke only when he gave me the news. The police had searched Horizon Arms. They found the blood on the 12th floor. They found the marks where the wire had been anchored. But the package, the wire, and the man were gone. They found a maintenance hatch on the roof that had been left open, a perfect escape route. He asked to see the texts. I reached for my phone, but the thread was empty. The messages had auto-deleted, leaving no trace of the anonymous employer. The $300 was still in the envelope in my bag, but the bills felt wrong, cold, as if they had been kept in a freezer. I was discharged a few days later, my leg a map of jagged scars that would never fully heal. I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare had stayed in the Horizon Arms. But as I sat on my sofa this morning, the sun barely peeking through the blinds, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. I opened it, my heart stopping as I read the 3 words on the screen, "Thank you for delivering." I looked up at my front door. It was locked. It was deadbolt. But as I sat there in the silence of my own home, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound from the hallway outside. A squeal. Desperation has a specific smell. It's the scent of overdue utility bills, the metallic tang of an empty bank account, and the stale air of a studio apartment where the heat was cut off 3 days ago. That's why, when the text arrived from an unknown number at 2 a.m., I didn't question the logic. I questioned the math. $300. Cash. All I had to do was deliver a plain cardboard box to an abandoned complex on the edge of the industrial district. No names. No signatures. Just a drop-off at Unit 12C of the Horizon Arms. Most people would have seen a red flag. I saw 3 weeks of groceries and a way to keep my lights on. The Horizon Arms sat like a rotting molar in the jaw of the city. It was a brutalist nightmare, a concrete monolith that had once promised luxury but now only promised tetanus and bad memories. The windows were hollow eyes, most of them shattered or boarded up with rotting plywood. The city had condemned it a decade ago after a series of disappearances that the papers liked to call the concrete vanishing. As I pulled my rusting sedan into the cracked parking lot, the silence of the place felt heavy, almost pressurized. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears like static. The instructions in the text were surgical. Use the keypad. Enter code 0-9-1-4. I stepped up to the main entrance, the air tasting of wet limestone and ozone. The keypad was ancient, its plastic buttons yellowed like old teeth. When I punched in the code, the electromagnetic lock groaned, a sound like a rusted lung gasping for air, and the heavy glass door clicked open. I stepped into the lobby, and that's when the first wave of wrongness hit me. It wasn't the darkness. It was the cleanliness. Amidst the peeling wallpaper and the layers of dust, there was a single, pristine white envelope sitting on the marble security desk. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 crisp $100 bills. No note, no further instructions. Just the cold, hard reality of the bribe. Finding the money up front should have been my cue to run. It should have told me that the job was already done, that I was being paid for my presence, not my service. But greed is a powerful sedative. I tucked the cash into my pocket, gripped the handle of the small, surprisingly heavy cardboard box, and looked toward the elevators. They were dead, of course. That meant 12 flights of stairs in a tomb. The stairwell was a vertical void. My flashlight beam was a pathetic, flickering needle stitching its way through the shroud of blackness. Every step echoed, a rhythmic thud-thud that sounded less like my own feet and more like a heartbeat coming from the walls themselves. By the 4th floor, the air grew thick with a cloying, sweet rot, the smell of something organic breaking down behind the concrete. By the 8th floor, I started hearing the humming. It was low, a vibration in the soles of my shoes more than a sound in my ears. It was a melody I didn't recognize, something nursery rhyme simple but played in a minor key that made my skin crawl. When I finally reached the 12th floor, my lungs were burning and my vision was swimming in the narrow halo of my flashlight. The hallway of the 12th floor was long, a narrow throat of peeling paint and shadows that seemed to stretch further than the building's actual dimensions. Unit 12C was at the very end. The carpet beneath my feet was damp, soaking into my sneakers with a squelch that sounded like chewing. I approached the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I set the box down. The cardboard felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it contained a block of dry ice. I did exactly what the text had commanded. I knocked 3 times. Slow, deliberate. The sound of my knuckles against the wood was loud, a series of gunshots in the oppressive quiet. I waited, holding my breath, expecting the door to creak open, expecting a voice. But what came wasn't human. From behind the door of 12C, a sound erupted that froze the marrow in my bones. It was a squeal. High-pitched, ragged, and filled with a primal, agonizing terror. It was the sound of a pig being led to slaughter, a wet, screaming noise that vibrated through the wood and into my hands. I backed away, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the floor. The door didn't open, but the darkness further down the hallway did. Out of the shadows of a side alcove, a figure stepped into the periphery of my light. He was tall, impossibly thin, dressed in a pristine, tailored suit that looked black in the dim light. But it was his head that stopped my heart. He was wearing a mask. It wasn't a cheap plastic thing from a costume shop. It was hyper-realistic, made of what looked like cured leather and actual bristles. The snout was wet, the yellowed tusks jutted out from a permanent snarl, and the eyes were human, wide and glassy, staring through the slits of the pig's face. He didn't scream. He didn't charge. He just started walking toward me, a slow, measured gait. And he was humming. It was the same low, melodic drone I'd felt in the stairs. The squealing from behind the door grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing inside was trying to warn me, or perhaps it was just cheering for what was about to happen. Terror took over. My brain short-circuited into a single command: run. I spun around and bolted back the way I came, my lungs heaving, my flashlight beam splashing against the walls like spilt milk. I didn't look back. I could hear his shoes clicking on the tile behind me, a steady, unhurried pace that suggested he knew I had nowhere to go. I was halfway to the stairwell door when I felt it. I never saw the wire. It was strung at mid-shin height, a jagged line of heavy-duty barbed wire anchored into the door frames of the narrow hall. I hit it at full sprint. The wire didn't just stop me, it bit. It wrapped around my left leg with a sickening, metallic kiss, the barb sinking through my jeans and deep into the muscle. I went down hard, the momentum of my run causing the wire to tear upward, shredding my calf down to the bone. I let out a sound I didn't know I could make, a wet, sobbing shriek that joined the chorus of the pig behind the door. I looked back. The man in the pig mask had stopped about 10 feet away. He didn't move to finish me. He just stood there, tilting his head with a curious, animalistic tilt, watching the blood pool on the damp carpet. It was dark, almost black under my flashlight's dying glow. The humming stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, laminated sign. Pain was a white-hot flare in my brain, but I knew if I stayed there, I was dead. I grabbed the wire with my bare hands, the barbs slicing into my palms, and I roared as I ripped my leg free. The sound of my own flesh tearing was like wet Velcro. I crawled, dragging my mangled limb, leaving a thick, glistening trail behind me. My fingers found the handle of the stairwell door. I pulled. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the pain. I pulled again, throwing my entire weight against the heavy steel door. It was jammed. Someone had shoved a thick wad of industrial carpet into the gap between the door and the frame from the other side, wedging it shut. I was trapped in a hallway with a butcher. I looked around, my eyes landing on a piece of broken, rusted pipe that had fallen from a ceiling vent. I grabbed it, shoving the end into the door crack, using every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I had left. The door groaned. I looked back over my shoulder. The pig-masked man was still there, but he had moved closer. He was standing directly over the spot where I had bled out. He held up the sign. In the flickering light of my dropped flashlight, I read the words written in neat, calligraphic script, "Be my Valentine." With a final, desperate heave, the pipe acted as a lever. The carpet wedge popped free, and the stairwell door swung open. I tumbled inside, slamming the door shut and shoving the pipe through the handles just as a heavy weight thudded against the other side. I didn't wait. I slid down the stairs on my backside, bumping down 12 flights of concrete, my leg a screaming ruin, until I reached the lobby and burst out into the night air. The police arrived 20 minutes later. I was sitting on the curb, my shirt tied around my leg as a makeshift tourniquet, shivering despite the humidity. I told them everything. The text, the box, the mask, the wire. They went in with tactical gear and dogs. I waited for the sirens to bring out the monster in the chute. They came out empty-handed. The detective, a man with tired eyes and a voice like sandpaper, stood over me as the paramedics loaded me onto a gurney. He told me they found Unit 12C. It was an empty room, thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. There was no box. There was no barbed wire in the hallway. There wasn't even a drop of blood on the carpet. He looked at me like I was a junked-out hallucinating wreck, despite the fact that my leg was literally held together by a prayer and a bloody t-shirt. They checked the roof. A maintenance hatch was found unlocked, but there was no sign of anyone. I pulled out my phone to show him the texts, the proof that I wasn't crazy. I opened the messaging app, but the thread was gone. Not just deleted, the entire history with that unknown number had been scrubbed, leaving no trace it had ever existed. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors called it a traumatic laceration, likely from exposed scrap metal in the abandoned building. They gave me stitches and a bottle of pills and sent me back to my dark, cold apartment. I sat there on my sofa, the $300 still sitting on my coffee table, mocking me. It was real. I knew it was real. The sun was just beginning to grey the sky the next morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. My heart skipped a beat. I reached for it, my breath hitching in my throat. It was a notification from an unknown number. I opened it, my heart stopping as I read the 3 words on the screen. "Thank you for delivering." I looked up at my front door. It was locked. It was deadbolt. But as I sat there in the silence of my own home, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound from the hallway outside. A squeal. The air in Horizon Arms didn't just smell of decay. It tasted like a dying transmission, a mouthful of copper and wet wool that coated the back of my throat. My boots hammered against the rotted remains of the hallway carpet, each step throwing up a cloud of grey, stagnant dust that danced in the dying beam of my flashlight. Behind me, the sound of the pig mask man's humming drifted through the dark like a nursery rhyme sung in a graveyard. It was a soft, rhythmic melody that seemed to pulse in time with the strobe-like flickering of the overhead emergency lights. Every time the light cut out, the world became a jagged void of absolute black. Every time it flashed back on, the hallway seemed to have stretched, the walls leaning inward as if the building itself was trying to swallow me whole. My lungs were burning, the oxygen in this place replaced by a thick, heavy pressure that felt like being underwater. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just focused on the far end of the corridor, where the exit sign hung by a single wire, glowing with a sickly, rhythmic crimson. Then, the world shattered. I didn't see the wire. It was a whisper of silver in the strobe light, a ghost of a line stretched tight between 2 rusted door frames. I was at a full sprint when I hit it. The impact wasn't a dull thud. It was a sharp, mechanical snap that vibrated through my entire skeleton. The barbed wire, thick and crusted with what looked like decades of dried filth, caught me just above the right ankle and across the midshin of my left. My momentum did the rest. I felt the teeth of the wire bite deep, sinking past the denim of my jeans and into the soft tissue with a sickening, wet resistance. It didn't just stop me, it anchored me. My upper body kept moving forward, and for a split second, I was suspended in the air, a puppet with its strings suddenly yanked taut. The agony was a wall of white noise. It wasn't a sharp sting. It was a cold, grinding sensation that felt like someone was trying to saw through my tibia with a rusted file. I hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the remaining breath from my lungs. I tried to pull my legs toward me, a natural instinct to flee, and that's when the true horror of the trap revealed itself. The more I struggled, the deeper the barb sank. I could hear the sound of my own flesh tearing, a sound like a wet rag being ripped in half. I looked down, my flashlight rolling away and casting a long, trembling beam across the floor. The wire had shredded the meat of my calf down to the bone. I could see the pale, ivory glint of my own skeleton through the jagged, oozing gap in my leg. The blood didn't just flow, it pulsed out in rhythm with my frantic heart, a dark, viscous stain that looked black under the strobing light. I let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a high-pitched, rattling wheeze of pure, unadulterated desperation. I was pinned. I was a piece of meat on a hook, and the butcher was closing in. I looked back. The man in the pig mask had stopped. He was standing maybe 20 feet away, perfectly framed by the high-contrast flashes of the dying lights. In the darkness, he was a silhouette of impossible height. In the light, the hyper-realistic textures of the mask were nauseating. The oversized, wet-looking snout, the yellowed, crooked tusks, the small, dark holes where eyes should be, staring at me with a terrifying, vacant calm. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He just stood there, tilting his head slightly to the side, watching me bleed out onto the rotted floorboards. He began to hum again, the same low, distorted tune, and I realized he was enjoying the spectacle. He was watching the life drain out of me in the static-choked silence of the hallway. The desperation hit me then, a cold, predatory survival instinct that bypassed the pain. I reached out, my fingers clawing at the floor, finding nothing but crumbling plaster and oily filth. I grabbed my right leg, my hands slick with my own warmth, and I pulled. I didn't care about the damage anymore. I just needed to be free. The barbs groaned as they scraped against the bone, a sensation so visceral I thought I would vomit. With a final, agonizing yank, the wire gave way, taking chunks of my calf with it. I collapsed back, my head hitting the wall, gasping for air that felt like needles. I began to crawl. I didn't use my legs. I dragged myself forward with my elbows, my mangled limbs trailing behind me like dead weight. Every inch was a battle against the void that was trying to pull my consciousness under. The exit door was 10 feet away. 5 feet. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the stairwell door. I pulled. It didn't budge. I pulled again, my vision blurring, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven beat against my ribs. The door was solid. It was as if it had been welded shut. I looked down at the base of the frame and saw it. A thick, grimy wad of industrial carpet had been jammed into the gap between the door and the floor, wedged in so tightly that it acted as a mechanical lock. It was a malicious, calculated move. He hadn't just trapped the hallway, he had ensured there was no way out. I heard his footsteps then. Slow, deliberate, the heavy thud of boots on the hollow floor. He was coming to finish the job. I looked around wildly, my eyes landing on a length of heavy, rusted pipe that had fallen from the ceiling during my struggle. I grabbed it, my knuckles white, and shoved the end of the pipe into the gap above the carpet wad. I threw my entire weight against it, screaming through clenched teeth as the pain in my legs flared into a blinding, white-hot sun. The pipe groaned. The carpet began to shred. With a violent, metallic crack, the door popped open just an inch. I didn't wait. I shoved my fingers into the crack and hauled the door open with a strength born of pure, unrefined terror. I scrambled into the stairwell, the cool air of the concrete shaft hitting my face like a benediction. I turned to slam the door shut, to lock myself away from the nightmare in the hallway. But as the door began to swing closed, the strobing light in the hall caught him one last time. The pig-masked man wasn't moving toward the door anymore. He was standing perfectly still, his tall, lean frame casting a shadow that stretched all the way to my feet. In his hands, he held up a small, hand-painted sign. The letters were crude, written in a dark, brownish-red substance that looked too fresh to be paint. It read, "Be my Valentine." The door clicked shut, the heavy latch falling into place. I was alone in the darkness of the stairwell, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where my screams had been. I sat there, slumped against the cold concrete, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. I waited for the sound of him pounding on the door. I waited for the handle to turn. But there was nothing, only the distant, muffled sound of a soft, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Later, when the police finally broke down the heavy entrance doors and found me huddled in a pool of my own blood, the world began to move in a surreal, disjointed blur. The paramedics worked on my leg, their faces grim as they looked at the jagged, hollowed-out ruin of my calf. I tried to tell them about the wire. I tried to tell the detective about the man in the pig mask and the sign and the box I had delivered to 12C. The detective, a man with tired eyes and a coat that smelled of stale tobacco, came back to my hospital bed a few hours later. He shook his head slowly. He told me they had searched the 12th floor from end to end. There was no box. There was no barbed wire. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the carpet except for the trail I had left near the door. The hallway was empty, just a rotting corridor in an abandoned building. Even the stairwell door showed no signs of being jammed. They had found a maintenance hatch on the roof that had been left open, but no footprint, no mask, and no sign of another human being. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I wanted to show him the messages, the anonymous text, the instructions. I opened the messaging app, but the thread was gone. The screen was a blank, sterile white. The messages had auto-deleted, scrubbed from existence as if they had never been sent. There was no record of the $300 job, no record of the Horizon Arms. I went home the next morning, my leg wrapped in heavy bandages, my mind a fractured mosaic of strobe lights and pig tusks. I locked the front door. I slid the deadbolt. I pushed a chair under the handle, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. I sat in my darkened living room, the silence of my apartment feeling like a heavy, suffocating shroud. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A single notification. An unknown number. I opened it, my heart stopping as I read the 3 words on the screen. "Thank you for delivering." I looked up at my front door. It was locked. It was deadbolt. But as I sat there in the silence of my own home, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound from the hallway outside. A squeal. The sound was not human. It was a wet, high-pitched vibration that tore through the thin wood of my apartment door like a jagged blade. It was the sound of a throat full of thick, clotted fluid trying to scream, a rhythmic pulsing of air that I had first heard in the darkness of Horizon Arms. My hand shook so violently that the phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the hardwood. The screen flickered, that final, untraceable notification glowing like a radioactive ember in the dark of my living room. "Thank you for delivering." The words felt like a physical weight, a cold iron collar cinched tight around my neck. I remembered the weight of the cardboard box I had carried up those 12 flights of stairs. I remembered the way the air in that abandoned building felt like static on a dead television channel, thick with the smell of wet rot and ancient, undisturbed dust. Desperation is a slow-acting poison. It makes you overlook the jagged edges of reality until you are already bleeding. When the text first arrived, offering $300 for a simple drop-off, I didn't see the hook. I only saw the rent I couldn't pay and the empty cabinets in my kitchen. Horizon Arms was a tomb of concrete and rusted rebar, a skeletal remain of a housing project that the city had forgotten to bury. I should have turned back the moment I saw the boarded-up windows, but the keypad code worked. The door groaned open, revealing a lobby that smelled of stagnant water and something sweeter, something like old meat left in the sun. The envelope was there, just like the message said. A crisp white rectangle sitting on a pile of debris, containing $300 in $20 bills. It was a lure. I felt the paper between my fingers, and the fear that had been gnawing at my gut was replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I thought I was the one winning. I thought I was outsmarting the world. I began the climb. 12 floors. Each landing was a gallery of shadows, the dim red glow of the emergency exit lights casting long, distorted shapes against the peeling wallpaper. The silence was absolute, a heavy, velvet pressure against my eardrums. By the time I reached the 12th floor, my lungs were burning, the air tasting of copper and mold. Unit 12C was at the very end of a hallway that seemed to stretch into a black void. I placed the box on the floor. I knocked 3 times. The sound echoed through the entire floor, a hollow, rhythmic thud that felt like a heartbeat. And then, the silence broke. A squeal erupted from behind the door, a piercing, panicked sound that made my hair stand on end. It wasn't a recording. It was the sound of something living, something terrified. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and that's when he stepped out from the darkness of a side maintenance closet. He was tall, his frame draped in a tattered, oil-stained trench coat that seemed to absorb what little light remained. But it was the face that broke my mind. A hyper-realistic pig mask, the latex glistening as if it were wet with sweat or blood. The snout was oversized, the nostrils flared, and the eyes were just dark, empty holes that stared into my soul. He didn't rush. He didn't scream. He just began to walk toward me, a slow, methodical gait, humming a soft, nursery rhyme tune that was almost drowned out by the wet rasp of his breathing. I turned and bolted. My boots thundered against the linoleum, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I didn't see the trap. I didn't see the thin, silver glint of the wire until it was too late. I hit it at full speed. It wasn't a fishing line. It was thick, industrial-grade barbed wire, strung waist-high across the hallway like a cruel joke. I felt the metal teeth bite through my jeans, sinking deep into the meat of my thigh. I screamed as the momentum of my own flight shredded my leg down to the bone. I collapsed, the world spinning into a haze of white-hot agony. I looked back. The man in the pig mask had stopped. He didn't finish me. He just stood there, his head tilted to the side, watching me bleed out onto the floor. He continued to hum that low, vibrating tune. I could see the glistening surface of the mask, the way the dim red light caught the artificial wrinkles in the rubber. He was enjoying the spectacle. He was a connoisseur of my terror. Adrenaline is the only reason I'm alive. I reached down, my fingers slick with my own hot blood, and grabbed the wire. I pulled. The barbs tore at my palms, but I didn't care. I ripped my leg free with a sickening sound of rending tissue and began to crawl. I reached the stairwell door, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it didn't budge. I looked through the small, wired glass window. The attacker had jammed a thick wad of industrial carpet into the frame from the other side. I was trapped in the hallway with the pig. I scanned the floor, my vision blurring, and found a length of rusted iron pipe that had fallen from a ceiling grate. I jammed it into the gap of the door, screaming with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The metal groaned, the wood splintering, until finally, the door gave way. I tumbled into the stairwell, the cold air hitting my face like a benediction. I turned back one last time before the heavy door clicked shut. The man was standing at the end of the hall, perfectly still. He wasn't humming anymore. In his hands, he held a piece of cardboard, a flap he had ripped from the very box I had delivered. On it, written in what looked like thick, black grease, were 3 words, "Be my Valentine." I didn't stop until I reached the street. I didn't stop until I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car. But the horror didn't end with the sirens. The police searched Horizon Arms from top to bottom. They found nothing. No box. No barbed wire. No man in a pig mask. The blood on the floor was there, a dark, jagged trail that led to a dead end. But the detective told me they found a hidden maintenance hatch on the roof that had been left ajar. Whoever he was, he had vanished into the city skyline like smoke. When I tried to show them the text messages, the thread was gone. The app had auto-deleted the conversation, leaving me with a phone full of static and a leg held together by 56 stitches. I thought I was safe in my apartment. I thought the deadbolts and the distance would protect me. But as I sat there in the dark, the thank you for delivering notification still burning on my screen, I realized the truth. The box wasn't the delivery. My fear was. The $300 wasn't a payment. It was a down payment. The squeal came again, louder this time, right against the base of my front door. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic scratching, the sound of something sharp dragging across the wood. I stared at the door handle. I watched as it began to turn, slowly, tentatively, as if testing the lock. I knew what was on the other side. I knew the smell of the rubber mask and the sound of the humming. I reached for the kitchen knife on the table, my hand shaking so hard I could barely grip the handle. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. It was a small, white envelope. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was inside. But the curiosity was a sickness, a compulsion I couldn't fight. I crawled across the floor, my mangled leg trailing behind me, and picked it up. Inside was another $300, and a small, hand-drawn map of my own apartment building, with a red X marking the spot where I was currently sitting. At the bottom of the map, in that same thick, black grease, were the words, "I love the way you run. See you soon, Valentine." The scratching stopped. The humming faded into the distance of the hallway, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the night. I looked at the money, the blood from my bandaged hand staining the bills. I realized then that I would never be done delivering. He wasn't going to kill me tonight. He was going to watch me. He was going to wait. I was a part of his collection now, a specimen in a jar, waiting for the next knock, the next text, the next squeal in the dark. I looked at the door, the deadbolt still holding, but I knew it didn't matter. You can't lock out something that you've already let inside. I sat there in the dim red glow of my oven clock, waiting for the phone to vibrate again, knowing that the next delivery would be the last one I ever made. The static in my head grew louder, a cacophony of white noise that drowned out the world, until all that was left was the memory of the pig's eyes and the feeling of the wire cutting through my skin. I am his Valentine, and the holiday has only just begun. The hospital room was a sterile void, a box of white tile and fluorescent hum that felt more like a tomb than a place of healing. The morning light didn't bring warmth. It filtered through the blinds in cold, jagged strips that sliced across my bedsheets like the wire that had claimed my flesh. My leg was a heavy, throbbing monument to the night before, wrapped in thick layers of gauze that were already beginning to bloom with the rust-colored stains of my own mortality. Every pulse of my heart was a wet, sickening reminder of the way the barbs had tasted my bone. The detective, a man named Miller whose face looked like it had been carved out of grey stone, sat in the corner. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had seen too many versions of the truth to believe in mine. He kept clicking a cheap ballpoint pen. Click, 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 a rhythmic static that hammered against my skull. I told them about Horizon Arms. I told them about the $300 in the white envelope that sat on my bedside table, a physical anchor to a reality they were already trying to erase. I told them about the pig. The way the mask didn't look like plastic or rubber, but like something harvested, something wet and curing in the dark. I told them about the squeal that sounded less like an animal and more like a soul being put through a meat grinder. Miller just sighed, the sound of air escaping a punctured tire. He told me the officers had searched every inch of the 12th floor. They found the door to 12C. It was rusted shut, the hinges fused by decades of neglect and salt air. There was no box. There was no barbed wire. There weren't even bloodstains on the floor, despite the fact that I had left a trail of gore that should have been visible from space. The hallway was a tomb of dust, undisturbed and grey, like a layer of volcanic ash. I screamed at him then. I pointed at my leg, at the jagged, weeping canyon of meat that the doctors had spent 4 hours stitching back together. I asked him how a man flays his own limb to the bone in an empty hallway. He didn't have an answer. He just looked at me with a pity that felt like a death sentence. He said the building was structurally unsound, that I might have fallen through a rotten floorboard or caught myself on a piece of exposed rebar. He said the mind does strange things under the influence of shock and blood loss. He said the pig was a hallucination born from the trauma. Then he told me the most terrifying thing of all. He told me they had checked the security feed from the gas station across the street. They saw me enter Horizon Arms at 11:45 p.m. They saw me crawl out of the service entrance 40 minutes later, screaming and clutching my leg. But in between those two moments, the thermal cameras picked up nothing. No heat signatures. No movement. Just the black, rotting silhouette of a building that should have been demolished 20 years ago. When he left, the silence in the room became predatory. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. I needed to see the messages. I needed the proof. I opened the encrypted thread, the one that had promised me $300 for a simple delivery. The screen flickered, a sudden burst of white static that burned my retinas. The text bubbles began to dissolve, the letters melting into jagged lines of code before vanishing into a black void. One by one, the timestamps, the instructions, the keypad code, everything I had used to navigate that house of horrors, was scrubbed from existence. The thread didn't just end, it unspooled itself from the fabric of my life. I was discharged 2 days later. The world felt thin, like a movie set that might fall over if I pushed too hard on the walls. I went back to my apartment, but the air there tasted like copper and wet fur. I kept the lights on, but the shadows in the corners felt heavy, weighted down by something that was watching and waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hyper-realistic snout. I heard the soft, rhythmic humming of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he knew I had nowhere left to run. The $300 sat on my dresser. I couldn't touch it. It felt cold, unnaturally heavy, like pieces of silver paid to a Judas who didn't even know what he was betraying. I realized then that the box hadn't been the delivery. The box was just the bait. I was the delivery. I had delivered myself into his world, into the jagged, barbed wire reality of the Horizon Arms, and he had marked me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across my bedroom floor. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hand hovering over my phone. The device felt like a live wire in my palm. My leg throbbed, a rhythmic ache that matched the beating of my heart. I felt the static growing louder in my head, a cacophony of white noise that drowned out the sound of the city outside. I thought about the sign he held up. Be my Valentine. The jagged, handwritten letters. The way he stood there, watching me bleed with a patience that was more terrifying than any violence. Then, the phone vibrated. It wasn't a text message. It wasn't a call. It was a phantom notification, a banner that appeared at the top of the screen from a sender with no name, no number, no digital footprint. It was a void where a person should have been. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes like cold fire. The words were simple, typed in a font that looked like it had been scratched into the glass from the inside. Thank you for delivering. I looked toward the window, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, I thought I saw a reflection in the glass that wasn't mine. It was tall. It was shadowed. And it was wearing a face made of cured, pink meat. The static in my brain reached a fever pitch, a screaming void that told me the truth I had been trying to outrun. The delivery wasn't over. I had just finished the first stage. I am his Valentine, and the holiday has only just begun.